Well, in the Disney version of this famous story, Aladdin is trapped inside the Cave of Wonders, only with his monkey, Abu, for company. And among the many treasures surrounding him, he picks out an old lamp. And while examining the lamp, he tries to just rub it a bit cleaner. And in doing so, he unintentionally summons the genie within. This super powerful genie then grants Aladdin 3 wishes. Now, if you've never seen the movie or you've never read the story, I'm not going to reveal what those 3 wishes are. I wouldn't do that. And I'm not even going to tell you if it works out for him. You can have the joy of finding that out yourself. But wouldn't it be great if you could have every wish come true? Whatever you wanted could happen. I mean, it sounds great, doesn't it? The problem is that sometimes the things that we wish for are not very good for us. And that's what the young man discovered in the story Jesus told. And Jesus told it to a very different crowd, from Jewish leaders to tax collectors and just to everyday folk. Now, I can tell you, Jesus was the best storyteller ever. And when he spoke, people just had to stop and listen, even if they didn't like what he was saying. And Jesus often told stories in what are known as parables. These are quite commonly described as earthly stories with a heavenly meaning. Often really very descriptive and with a real and emotional illustration, drawing out a very important spiritual truth. Now, the characters in this made-up story of Jesus all represent very real persons. We have the younger son, the older son, and the father. So the young man in our story, a bit like Aladdin, he also had 3 wishes. He wanted a lot of money. He wanted to spend that money to travel and see the world and just have the best time ever. And he wanted to be his own boss. And you know, the young man, he got his wishes, but they weren't granted to him by any genie. Now, in Luke chapter 15 and verse 12, the younger son asks his father for his share of his estate. Now, this would be money he would receive after his father had died, which would have been about half of what the older brother would receive. Now, though it's perfectly within his rights to ask for something like this, it was not a very loving thing to do, because it makes it look like that the son wished his father was dead, which is a horrible thing, isn't it? Now, how must the father have felt? And we can imagine that he was hurt. He was really sad. But the answer, surprisingly, to his son's request is yes, you can have that money. In verse 13, the son travels to a distant country. And it's clear from his behavior towards his father that he's already made that journey in his heart. He's been thinking it through a long time and chewing it over. And the fact that he went through with his desire was a display of willful disobedience to all the goodness his father had offered him. In verse 14, in the foreign land, the son spends all his inheritance on selfish and shallow things, shallow fulfillment, and in the end, as we heard in the song, loses everything. And at this point, he has to get a job. And that job is feeding pigs, which is a detestable job to any Jewish person. You see, according to the law of Moses, pigs were unclean animals. They couldn't be eaten, and they couldn't be used for sacrifices. So for a Jew to even touch a pig was like being poisoned. But the son was desperate. And he was paid so little, and he grew so hungry that he even longed to eat the pig's food. And to top it off, he could find no mercy from anyone. Verse 16 tells us, no one gave him anything. Apparently, once his wealth was gone, so were his friends. And finally, he begins to reflect on his miserable condition. And verse 17 tells us that he came to his senses. He realizes that even his father's servants have it better than he does. And it seems his painful, real circumstances actually help him to see his father in a new light. And hope begins to dawn in his heart. And so the son devises a plan of action. And verse 18 tells us that he'll admit his terrible behavior, and he will give up his rights as a son. And he'll take on the position of a servant. And he realizes that, he has no right to blessing from his father. He has nothing to offer to his father except really a life of service. And so returning home, this son is prepared to fall at his father's feet and beg for mercy. But remember, this is a parable. The youngest son represents someone very real. And that person is us. It's everybody. It's all of humankind. People who by choice have ignored God, have been running away from him, not wanting anything to do with him. Maybe you feel your life is pretty low at the moment, and there really is not much hope. Maybe you've been searching inside for an answer, but you just can't find one. Well, this is the point where you just have to stop and think. Like the prodigal son, you must be prepared to lay aside all your pride, any feelings of entitlement, and cast yourself on the mercy of God. Because there is no hope in anything or anyone else. Maybe that just sounds too much for you. Well, don't turn off. Stay with me, because you are going to see that there is a very real, genuine hope. And the story continues. Do you remember the father? Verse 20 reads, while he, that's the son, was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. So the father, he runs to his wayward son. He embraces him. He kisses him. And the returning son, well, he begins his prepared speech. And his father, well, he just cuts him off and begins issuing commands to his servants to honor his son. The best robe, please. The best ring. And let's put on the best feast. The father doesn't question his son. He doesn't lecture him. Instead, he joyfully forgives him and receives him back into his family. But remember, this is a parable. The father represents someone very real. And that person is God. See, this is a wonderful picture of God's love and grace, his undeserved favor toward the people that he made. It's you and me, guys. We see here his heart is full of compassion for his children. And he stands ready to welcome anyone who realizes their need to be forgiven of their sin by a holy and perfect God. And the son in the story, well, he was satisfied to return home as a servant. But to his surprise and delight, he's restored back into the full privileges of being his father's son. But you know what? It goes even further than that. The father's command to bring the best robe for his returned son, that's a sign of dignity and honor. Proof of the son's acceptance back into the family. The ring for the son's hand, that's a sign of authority and sonship. The sandals on his feet, again, they're a sign of not being a servant. Servants didn't have footwear in those days. And the fattened calf to be prepared, you remember. And a party held in honor of this returned son. In those days, fattened calves, they were saved for very, very special occasions. This was not any party. It was a rare and complete celebration. Now, you know what? It'd be really nice for me to stop here and just leave you with happy days. But Jesus hasn't finished. There's still one more thing that he wants to say. Do you remember the third character in our story? Well, the older brother, he's been observing everything that's been going on. And verses 25 to 30 tell us that the older son had come in from the field, heard the music and the dancing, and found out that his younger brother had safely come home with much jubilation. But he becomes angry and refuses to go into the house. And his father goes to him and pleads with him to come in. But he answers his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered everything, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." That's a bit of a sad end to the story, isn't it? And by the oldest son's reaction, we see that his relationship with his younger brother and with his father was not a very healthy one. It seems that he felt that in order to earn his father's merit, it could only be met through obedience and hard work. And because of that, he's the one who deserves a party. He thinks his father, well, he's rather stingy and unfair, actually. Verse 29 says, "You never gave me even a young goat." But again, the response from the Father is one of love and of grace and of gentleness. Verses 31 and 32. "My son," the Father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The older son should have known that their relationship was never based on performance. And that was clearly demonstrated in the father's gracious actions. We had to celebrate. It was a necessary thing to do, and it was utterly appropriate. But remember, this is a parable. The older son represents someone very real. So we're just going to step back in our Bibles to the beginning of chapter 15, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2. And it begins like this. "Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Jesus here is comparing the older brother with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. You see, outwardly they lived, blameless lives, but inwardly their attitudes were hateful and unforgiving. They saw their relationship with God as based on their performance. And they considered themselves deserving of God's favor, unlike those undeserving sinners among them. You see, they didn't understand grace and were in fact angered by it, like the older brother. They viewed God, again, as rather stingy in his blessings, and they considered that if God were to accept tax collectors and sinners into his family, then he would be unfair. Well, maybe you're thinking at this point, okay, fair enough. This doesn't really affect me, does it? Because I'm neither a Pharisee or a teacher of the law. Well, let me ask you, do you believe that if you live a good life, then you should get a good life? That God owes you a smooth road? Do you think you can earn a right relationship with God through your own goodness and your hard work? Do you think maybe Christians only obey God out of fear and without much joy? Seems a pretty hard life. So actually you see, we can also see ourselves in the older brother. Well, to all of you here and all those watching online, I hope you can see that this parable spoken by Jesus has important things to say to us. And most of all, I hope you've seen this as one of the most beautiful pictures of God's grace. You see, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We've all run from God. We've all selfishly squandered our resources and allowed sin to rule our actions. But God is ready to forgive everyone who recognizes they have done wrong before him and can't earn a right relationship with him through their own works. You see, it's all of grace through faith. That is faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who came into our world and lived the perfect life that we could never do, so that we can be completely forgiven of all our sin when he died upon the cross. And you see, this is all possible when you put your trust in Jesus.